In 1977, Terry Brooks made his publishing debut with The Sword of Shannara, and since then he has published over 30 books set within that world. A fantasy author may be a strange choice to write a Star Wars novelization, but Star Wars has always been much more of an adventure story akin to a fantasy novel than to outright science fiction. And in his memoir, Brooks describes the experience of writing the novelization as an extremely happy and fulfilling experience for him. Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, made it to #1 on the New York Times bestseller list for 4 straight weeks, from the week of May 23rd to the week of June 13th, 1999, and was ultimately on the New York Times list for 11 weeks. I know I read it and bought it back when the movie was released in 1999, but I had few memories of the novelization itself. Rather, I remembered that there were 4 different dust jackets that you could choose from, and while my library copy here has Darth Maul on the front and Darth Sidious on the back, my personal copy, which is long gone, had Obi-Wan Kenobi on the front and Qui-Gon Jinn on the back. So, a brief summary. Qui-Gon Jinn and his young apprentice Obi-Wan Kenobi are charged with protecting Queen Amidala of Naboo as she seeks to end the blockade on her planet by the Trade Federation. Their quest will bring the Jedi, as well as one of the Queen's young handmaidens, to Tatooine and to the shop where Anakin Skywalker works, dreaming of the day that he and his mother can find freedom. As a novelization, The Phantom Menace, the novelization, hews pretty closely to The Phantom Menace, the movie, which is not surprising, especially back in the time of the prequel trilogy when novelization still came out before the movie came out. This was really meant to whet your appetite and get people interested in seeing the movie and seeing these scenes brought to life. However, there are several things in the novelization that don't appear in the film, and I'm not just talking about deleted scenes that you could see on the DVD or Blu-ray releases that show short bits that Lucas, for whatever reason, decided to cut out of the final film. In talking to Lucas, Brooks decided that he really wanted to focus on Anakin as a character, so rather than opening on Naboo and Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi arriving there with the blockade in progress, it begins on Tatooine. We see Anakin lose a pod race to Sebulba, who cheats. We see what Anakin's life on Tatooine is like, what his dreams are, and what he yearns for. And we also see a scene where Anakin is going to purchase droids for Watto, and while he's heading back from the Jawa Sandcrawler, he encounters a Tusken Raider who's been injured. And to give us a sense of the kind of person that Anakin is, Anakin helps him, he tends him, even though he knows that means he won't get back to Mos Espa before nightfall. And I definitely thought that was an interesting choice here. You could probably argue that we don't need to spend that much time with Anakin, that it's enough of an introduction to meet him in Watto's shop. But I really liked getting to see another pod race, just Anakin's normal day-to-day life, how his mother wants him to succeed but doesn't want him to risk his life in pod racing, and also just the inherent kindness in Anakin's personality that, yeah, it makes sense that he helps these people he's never met, because we see him earlier helping a Tusken who probably would have tried to kill him under normal circumstances. So I think Brooks did a good job fleshing out Anakin's character, and I also liked what he did with Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi, that there's not much there that's not revealed in the movie, but we do very much get the sense that Qui-Gon is a maverick, he doesn't really follow what the rest of the Jedi do, and that's a point of contention between him and Obi-Wan, that he's always picking up strays or people or creatures that he thinks he can help, and that Obi-Wan thinks is taking him away from what he should be doing, what his mission is, what his purpose is. We also see really well how hurt Obi-Wan is by Qui-Gon's proclamation when they're on Coruscant before the Jedi Council that he wants to take Anakin as his apprentice and that Obi-Wan is ready to become a Jedi Knight in his own right. And I think that's something that Obi-Wan would be very excited about, passing the trials, becoming a Jedi Knight, moving on. But at the same time, he feels like he's being replaced by Anakin. And it definitely sets up that Obi-Wan is fulfilling his master's word by agreeing to train Anakin, but it's not going to be the same relationship that Anakin would have had with Qui-Gon. That in the end, Obi-Wan believes what his master said, but there's still that initial tension just at the beginning of his acquaintance with Anakin. I also felt like the novelization gave us more of a sense how flabbergasted Chancellor Valorum was by Amidala requesting a vote of no confidence in his leadership. We see him meeting her when she arrives, and he seems kind, and he seems like he will listen to what she has to say. But he's just right there saying, oh, everything's corrupt, he's listening to other people, he won't agree to help you. And so you can see how she's really been prodded into that moment that she's frustrated. She's so frustrated that the Senate won't address the injustices that is happening to the Naboo. And her trusted advisor, the senator for Naboo, is there telling her, this is the choice you need to make, this is what you need to do. And she does it. And it plays right into Palpatine's hands. I also felt like it was pretty obvious in The Phantom Menace, the film, that Palpatine is Sidious. I think it's just hard to hide Ian McDiarmid's face and his voice and his demeanor and just the fact that Sidious looks so much like Emperor Palpatine. If the fact that the senator's name wasn't Palpatine didn't tip you off to the fact that he's the evil Sith Lord, just the fact that they look and sound very similar would. But in the novelization, Brooks definitely separates those two so that you don't really see a connection between Palpatine and Sidious. Sidious is obviously scheming and getting the Trade Federation to do his dirty work for him, but you can't draw that immediate connection between Palpatine and Sidious that you could in the film. Sidious is very much presented as a different character who, especially in the end, happens to be on Naboo when the senator's on Naboo, but nothing more concrete than that. And finally, I thought the pace of the novelization was good. There's action, there's slow points, but it keeps you reading and never feels like it gets bogged down in really slow parts where you feel like, I don't want to continue. And I think that the short size really helps here. This is only 24 chapters. They're not super long. So it never feels like the story is dragging, even when it's visiting perhaps some of my least favorite characters in Star Wars. And speaking of my least favorite characters in Star Wars, did the novelization make me like Jar Binks anymore? And the answer is no. Jar Jar on screen comes off as too much of a buffoon, and I find in the novelization reading his dialect written out as Misa, M-E-E-S-A, was hard. It was hard to get through. Jar Jar's optimistic. He always ends up on his feet like a cat, but he's an idiot. And I find that really tiring to read and tiring to watch. I think Ahmed Best in the film did exactly what he was directed to do, but the problem is I just don't agree with that direction. I think it's one thing to have a character who is comic relief, and it's another thing to have a character who is just so incredibly foolish and silly to the point that it messes with the overall feel of the movie, that this is supposed to be, you know, there's all these political maneuverings, there's battles, But then we'll cut to Jar Jar, who's just flailing his way through a battle. And I do have to admit that every time a Jar Jar scene came up in here, I was sort of hurrying to get to someone else's scene, someone else's viewpoint. And while I do like the added Anakin scenes, there's one where Anakin knows that Padme and Qui-Gon are leaving. He's so angry and frustrated, and he's not sure how to address his emotions, and he takes it out on a Rodian child, just beats him in the street. And I think it's a really nice foreshadowing of that deep-seated anger that Anakin will especially struggle with in episodes 2 and 3. But at the same time, I think Lucas's choice to make Anakin so young, to make him 9 years old, while I know he did it to show that this is a young boy, he's so full of promise, he has so many opportunities ahead of him, so you wouldn't see him and go, Darth Vader. You would be surprised by what he turns into. We have just the awkward scenes where he meets Padme, he asks if she's an angel. In the novelization, he tells her that he's going to marry her. And then the scene during the battle for Naboo where he's in the Naboo starfighter and then the autopilot engages and they're up there and he just inadvertently destroys the Trade Federation ship. And that just feels a lot like Jar Jar scenes to me, where Anakin doesn't know what he's doing, he's randomly hitting buttons, and he happens to do something really good that helps everyone out and actually literally ends the fighting because it stops all the battle droids. And it's not Brooks's fault because he's writing a novelization of the screenplay he was presented with, but I guess it's my issue with Phantom Menace that I wish that Lucas had stuck with his original idea to have Anakin a teenager instead of making him this little small boy who I guess is used by the Force to accomplish things. And I would have liked to see, like in the pod racing, him using his skills a little more rather than pure luck. And while I appreciated how Brooks made Sidious and Palpatine two separate characters, I feel like in trying to preserve the mystery of Queen Amidala's identity, that Padme was the queen all along and that who we thought was the queen was actually Sabe, her decoy, we don't really get any scenes in Padme's point of view until after that revelation. And I feel like that's a shame. I think that her viewpoint would have been a really nice addition to the story. I would have liked to know her thoughts on things, especially meeting Anakin, seeing how he and his mother live, seeing how Tatooine is, that since it's beyond the reach of the Republic's rules don't apply to it. But instead, she's there, but we don't get much with her at all, and I think that's a real shame and a real lack here. It still bothers me that Qui-Gon doesn't try harder to free Shmi as well. I know that they don't have the funds, Watto's very argumentative, but it always felt like to me in the movie that he just didn't try hard enough to free Anakin's mother. And I'm sure that could be just like Jedi reasoning, that since they're taken from their family so young, it wouldn't really occur to him how important it would be to free Anakin's mother as well. Like, she wouldn't be involved in his training, so it's okay to leave her on Tatooine. And like, this is just like my problem with the movie, that these characters would see this woman and this child in this situation, free the child, take him away, and leave the mother, and apparently no one returns to check on her until 10 years later in Attack of the Clones? Like at least E.K. Johnston's Padme books had Padme, after she was done being queen, trying to go back to Tatooine and free Shmi and free other slaves, but it still feels like, girl, that was 2 years later. You waited 2 years? You left this woman in slavery for 2 years? And finally, just two things about how Brooks wrote that I had, some issues with. The first was that I didn't feel like the action scenes especially were descriptive enough or exciting enough to match up to what we saw in the film. I was especially surprised by the fact that in all these lightsaber battles, he never described the colors of their blades. Like, he would describe what people looked like, but even when we first met Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan, and they're on board the Trade Federation vessel, and then the Neimoidians try to gas them, we heard they activate their lightsabers, but we never learned that Qui-Gon's is green or that Obi-Wan's is blue. Same with when Darth Maul appears and he lights his lightsaber, and I mean, that moment in the movie is so iconic. I was expecting a description of it, but it just seemed a lot more pedestrian than I was expecting. So for me, I did feel like that lightsaber fight on Naboo and that the space battle up above with the Trade Federation vessel could have been more descriptive, could have been more exciting. It worked, but the movie was definitely better. And my other niggling issue was that, for the most part, this book is limited third person. So we'll be in a scene, we'll be in one person's head. So we'll be in Qui-Gon's head, we'll move to another scene, and we're in Anakin's head. But especially towards the end, I noticed a little bit of head hopping, which is where you'll be in a scene, you won't have a scene break or anything, but you just jump into someone else's head. And I'm not sure if this was meant to be more of an omniscient third person, which, think of like Lord of the Rings, where we'll have like an out look and then we'll go in on one character and then we'll go out again. But from the beginning, this didn't really seem to be written as an omniscient third person. There didn't seem to be a narrator character. So scenes where, I'm thinking especially of the lightsaber fight, where it felt like we would jump from Qui-Gon's head to Obi-Wan's head to Darth Maul's head, and I did find that jarring at times. I don't think it was so egregious that I would stop reading. It gets a little confusing sometimes for readers, because if you start out in someone's head and then jump to another person's head, it's not always clear immediately whose POV you're in, and it's just nicer and tighter to keep that clean and like each scene only focused on one character. So in short, I rather enjoyed revisiting the novelization of The Phantom Menace. Do I think there are weak parts? Yes, but I do think that like a majority of the weak parts are also weak parts in the movie, so I'm not sure what Brooks could have done to make them stronger for me, because I already took issues with, say, Jar Jar's character or Anakin's age. I do find that, especially for the action scenes, it wasn't as descriptive as I could have wished, but I did like how Brooks built out Anakin's character, gave us some insights into Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan's relationship, and kept Palpatine and Sidious as two distinctly different characters. I think that the novelization is a fun complement to the film. So I would say the high point for me was the characterization. The low point was, I guess, just the fact that it is a novelization and it has to stick close to the film, even when there's parts of the film that I don't enjoy. So next up, publication-wise, would be Rogue Planet by Greg Bear, which was published in the year 2000. However, I already read that during my New Jedi Order reread. I do think that if you're interested in reading the New Jedi Order books, you should read Rogue Planet, especially before the Force Heretic trilogy. So I will put a link to that review up here in case you missed it. So instead, I will be jumping ahead to 2001 and an ebook short story by James Luceno, Darth Maul Saboteur.